Not just after Laylatul Qadr, but after iftar. Inshallah, may Allah give all of us the energy and the sleep and the rest, and also the tawfiq of being a part of these programs for the rest of the month of Ramadan in His own house. And may Allah accept all of your du'as, and may He forgive all of our shortcomings, inshallah. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. The real test is who's going to show up on Monday. It's not Sunday night, which is easy, but it's Monday. So inshallah, I'll see you all tomorrow. I'll try to keep it brief, so you can go and get some rest for the work day tomorrow. And I'll just mention a few ahadith regarding this topic that we have been covering so far, and that is hikmah as one of the virtues that the Quran in particular mentions for the prophets, that Allah bestowed on the prophets this virtue of wisdom, of discernment. After certain verses of the Quran, particularly in Surah Al-Jumu'ah, after He had done tazkiyah of them, meaning that He had purified their souls, and then He يُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةِ. As I mentioned in one of the previous talks, there is this sense sometimes that we have to go out and learn as much as possible, get as much knowledge as possible, ma'rifah as possible, and that is the primary task of every mu'min and every Muslim. And that is true. That is part of the process of getting closer to Allah, understanding His religion, understanding the creation of God. But there is a process that allows us to benefit first, and also to gain more knowledge, to gain more certainty about that which we know, and then Allah will open up those doors of His ma'rifah to us. So on the one hand, we are looking for knowledge, but on the other hand, knowledge in and of itself is not what we are attaining. Rather, knowledge itself is a means to another end. And before we get that knowledge, we have to begin to purify our soul, so that when we get that blessing, we know what to do with it. We know how to be grateful for it. And so Allah says, yes, knowledge is actually more important on one level in terms of the hierarchy of our values. And so when Nabi Ibrahim, he does his dua, he says that, oh Allah, teach them al-kitab wal-hikmah, and then to do tazkiyah of their soul. And that is in terms of the hierarchy that Nabi Ibrahim says. But then in other verses of the Quran, like in Surah Al-Jumu'ah, Allah says, وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابِ. So in some verses, Allah tells us the hierarchy of values, knowledge, and then tazkiyah. And then in other verses, Allah tells us the process. How do you get to knowledge? You get to it through tazkiyah. Alright. Now, when we talk about hikmah, we have ahadith that give us different aspects of this. So, some of the ahadith, they tell us that hikmah, for example, is zuhd. And this is the virtue that I'd like to spend tonight on, zuhd. Sometimes we think about it in terms of, there's this special word in English, asceticism, being an ascetic, A-S-C-E-T-I-C. But more generally, you can think about somebody who is renunciating or rejecting the world. That's our sense for what a zahid is. Yes? So in early Islam, before Islam came, there were these Christians, these monks, and these basically the superstars of the spiritual life of the Christian community. There were some of them in Egypt, They were called the Desert Fathers. They would go out and they would basically reject the world. They were part of their villages, but they would go out into the desert and maybe even build a house and separate themselves from their villages. And then there are other people in Syria who would do extreme and extraordinary feats of rejecting and renunciating the world. It said that some of them would fast days on end. This whole idea of not fasting for a few days, that you have to do iftar right when the Maghrib time comes in, and you can't connect different days. That is actually haram for us to do. We cannot, for example, not eat iftar. We should do iftar, and then do suhoor, and then we should begin the fast the next day. Right? You can't do multiple days of not eating anything. Now, these people, let's call them spiritual, I don't know what you would call them, spiritual superstars or spiritual masters in the Christian Middle East or West Asia, before the advent of Islam, these were incredible people. And their claim to fame was that they would totally renounce the world. They would do these extreme and extraordinary feats. It said that in some of their stories, one of these individuals, he would go on top of a very tall pole and he would stand there for days and even months on end. I don't know how they would get food up to him and how he would take care of everything else, but that's some of the stories, whether they're true or they're myth, whatever it might be. This is the image that we get for what these people would do. And of course, when we come to Islam is, Allah is responding to the world, but redirecting that energy and those concepts and those habits that the Arabs were familiar with in the right direction. We mentioned that hikmah had a certain meaning that people were familiar with, and then Allah redirects that and He expands on that. Now, in the case of the relationship between hikmah and zuhd, as I mentioned, some ahadith, they equate between hikmah and zuhd. This is my first point. That when we're reading hadith, we should be clear and we should try to figure out, for example, first of all, we should read the hadith, be more in the habits of reading a hadith, and getting familiar with the language of the Ahlul Bayt. And the Ahlul Bayt, they would respond to people as they saw what those individuals needed. Okay? They would look at the individual, they would look at, for example, their soul, or their state, their spiritual state, or their capacity, and they would respond to that person's need in certain ahadith. And that's what we get. So they say about medical ahadith that the Ahlul Bayt would give medical advice. These, for example, the herbal or natural medicine hadith. A lot of these are simply about this. This person is dealing with this illness, and this is the climate that he is in, and this is the cure for that illness that he is suffering from. And so you can't really expand this and create a whole philosophy of, for example, the medicine of the Ahlul Bayt, for example. Then there are other ahadith where the Ahlul Bayt, they give a more general principle. And it's very clear that they're giving this general principle. There's a question that is asked, and it's almost like they give a bigger answer than what was appropriate, for example, for the specific question that they asked. And so we should become a little bit more familiar with the language of the ahadith. Let me just give you one example from this issue of zuhd and its relation to hikmah. There's one hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi where it is said that Rasulullah, he speaks to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, where he says he is giving the tafsir of different ayat of the Quran. So one ayah is لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا. Okay? لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا. So that he can test you and try you to see which one of you is better in terms of a'mal. Right? Does better a'mal. The Prophet, he gives the tafsir of this verse in terms of أَيُّكُمْ أَزْهَدُ فِي الدُّنْيَا. Which one of you renounces or is more of a zahid in relation to this world? So the Prophet is translating ahsan with azhad, better with more renouncing or more rejecting of the world. And then he comes to this ayah of the Quran. This is in Surah Maryam, where in ayah number 12, where Allah speaks to Nabi Yahya alayhi salam. Okay, he speaks to Nabi Yahya. He says, Ya Yahya, khudh al-kitaba biquwwatin. I was trying to see if we have a Yahya in the audience. We do. Ya Yahya, khudh al-kitaba biquwwatin wa ataynahu al-hukma sabiyya. Oh Yahya, take the book with sort of, not lightly, biquwwatin, with steadfastness. وَآتَيْنَاهُ الْحُكْمَ صَبِيًّا. And we gave to him hukm or hikmah, wisdom, while he was still a young child. And then the Prophet, he translates hukm. He says, يَعْنِي الزُّهْدَ فِي الدُّنْيَا. الزُّهْدَ فِي الدُّنْيَا. In other words, the Prophet is translating what? He's translating hukm, wisdom, as zuhd. Yes? Is this clear? So he's saying hukm is zuhd. Wisdom is rejecting the world. In other ahadith, however, so now we're saying maybe the Prophet is speaking to Ibn Mas'ud and he's saying that if you want to find hukm, if you want to find wisdom, then reject the world. Move away from the world. Don't look towards the world. In another hadith, however, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. In another hadith, this is from our sixth Imam, he says, Man zahida fi dunya أثبت الله الحكمة في قلبه وأنطق بها لسانه وبصره عيوب الدنيا داءها ودواءها وأخرجه من الدنيا سالما إلى دار السلام. In this hadith, he does not say zuhd is the same thing as hikmah. As I mentioned the other day, some ahadith, they define for us hikmah as being ta'atullah and ma'rifatul imam. Yes? The obedience of God and knowing the imam. But in this hadith, the imam does not say that hikmah and true wisdom is, for example, zuhd, is to reject the world. He says the means, the instrument, the means by which you reach hikmah, that wisdom and that understanding, is rejecting the world. So now the Imam, he is giving us a better insight into what the relationship is. There are certain preliminaries, certain conditions, certain instruments that we have to use, in other words, doing tazkiyah of our souls so that Allah will grant us that wisdom. He says, Man zahida fi dunya, whoever renounces the world, athbata Allahu al-hikmata fi qalbih. Now, when I have forsaken the world, I've turned my back to the world, Allah now establishes hikmah in that person's heart, in my heart. وَأَنْتَقَ بِهَا لِسَانَهُ. And then Allah will make his tongue flow, wisdom flow from his tongue. وَبَصَّرَهُ عُيُوبَ الدُّنْيَا. And then the more I reject, the more I turn my back on the world, then Allah will allow me to see the evils and the faults of this world. دَاءَهَا وَدَوَاءَهَا. Both its illnesses, its evils, as well as the cure to these evils. وَأَخْرَجَهُ مِنَ الدُّنْيَا سَالِمًا إِلَى دَارِ السَّلَامِ. And then he will remove us from this world into in a state of peace and tranquility, into the world of salam, into the abode of salam. So my point here is that there is a process through which Allah will reveal his knowledge to us, and that is by this idea of zuhd. I still have to define for us and explain what exactly is zuhd. We said it's rejection, we said it's renunciation. It has something to do with these Christian monks standing on top of poles. Yeah? But what does Islam now say about zuhd? Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Okay, so we've talked about a little bit about hadith, how to maybe get a better sense of the differences between some of our different ahadith. We've talked about the relationship now between hikmah and zuhd. That zuhd is the process, it's the means, it's our instrument, our tool for getting to hikmah that Allah will now bestow us and will grant us with that wisdom to see how to not only live our lives better, but to see the insights and the evils and the harms of this world, and also to figure out the cure for those illnesses. Now let me just mention a few ahadith about zuhd itself. There's a hadith in Nahjul Balagha where Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, he says it very beautifully. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. The Imam says, Az-zuhdu kulluh. Zuhd in its entirety. So that gives us a signal, clue that this is it. This is the last word, and this will be my last hadith. Okay? This is perfectly arranged. Az-zuhdu kulluh bayna kalimatayn. Now there's two. This is a sneaky hadith because now I'm going to mention two things. Az-zuhdu kulluh bayna kalimatayn min al-Qur'an. Two ayat of the Qur'an, they encompass all of zuhd. قال الله تعالى لكي لا تأسوا على ما فاتكم ولا تفرحوا بما آتاكم. Allah, He will try us, and this is a ayah from Surah Al-Hadid, where Allah says that He will try us ما أصاب من مصيبة في الأرض ولا في أنفسكم إلا في كتاب من قبل أن نبرأها إن ذلك على الله يسير. There is no trial or difficulty that will befall you on the earth, nor in yourselves. So out in the external world or in the world that is within us, the psychological, the mental, the spiritual trials that Allah places in our hearts, or the difficulties from outside, our families, our finances, our communities, our society, our politics, all of those things. All of these things are established and have been written in the book of God, that recording of God. And then he continues on ayah number 23, لِكَيْ لَا تَأْسَوْا عَلَى مَا فَاتَكُمْ. So that you are not sort of put down and sort of giving up because of all of those things that have passed you and have gone out of your hand, that you have lost. وَلَا تَفْرَحُوا بِمَا آتَاكُمْ. Nor are you made overly happy and overly joyous and really boisterous because of that which comes to you. وَاللَّهُ لَا يُحِبُّ كُلَّ مُخْتَالٍ فَخُورٍ. Now, in this hadith, Amirul Mu'mineen says this is one of basically the ayat that encompasses what it means to be a zahid. And then he says, وَمَنْ لَمْ يَأْسَ عَلَى الْمَاضِي وَلَمْ يَفْرَحْ بِالْآتِ فَقَدْ أَخَذَ الزُّهْدَ بِطَرَفَيْهِ. Okay, a person who is not made overly sort of hopeless and overly saddened about what has passed him, what has been taken away from him, and a person who is not, meaning what has gone before, and nor is he made overly happy about that which is to come. Such a person has taken on zuhd, has grabbed zuhd betarafay, in its two extremes. Now, as I mentioned, zuhd is not simply about rejecting the world. The ayat do not say zuhd, it means that you don't go out and work, for example, or you don't go out and study, you don't try your hardest, because in the other parts of the Quran, we have that you should go out and try your hardest. فَإِذَا فَرَغْتَ فَانْصَبْ. When you are done with a task, then you should stand up and get on to the next task. You should work your hardest, you should try your best. What the ayat are saying, and what we get from Amirul Mu'mineen, is that, first of all, and this is the tafsir that Shahid Mutahhari gives in particular, he says that zuhd has certain pillars. First is to say that we are not putting all of our hopes and our dreams, and we are not hoping that we can attain a good life through the material benefits of this world. That sa'ada, that a person with a good fate or a good life, is not a person who has all of the material blessings that God can give someone. That's the first part. That, for example, if I have a huge income, that is not going to bring me ultimate satisfaction and ultimate happiness. Nor is it about my family, if I have a large family, or if I have even a very good community of friends and, for example, acquaintances. That's not what brings me contentment and happiness in my life. And so my ultimate goal in life should not be in terms of acquiring these material benefits. And material, I don't just mean the money or for example, the luxury, but also even the sort of the psychological and the emotional states that we go through. Right? That in itself is also part of this material world. When we say, يَوْمَ لَا يَنْفَعُ مَالٌ وَلَا بَنُونَ, it means that on the Day of Judgment, Allah is going to take us all of the things that we put our hopes in this world, whether it's our wealth or our children. Now, yes, our children in one society can bring us fame and it can bring us popularity. Right? If you have a lot of children. In this country, actually, if you have too many children, people look down on you. Right? They say, for example, maybe you are not using your resources properly and so on, right? But sometimes in other societies, they actually will give you more fame and more recognition if you have more children. In other words, you surround yourself with support. That is also part of this material world. In other words, what I mean by material is that it is a means to an end. And then the second thing is also that zuhd means that I don't separate myself from society, but rather, just as God has placed me in this society, He has also given me responsibility. Ultimately, my relationship is with Allah. And all of those resources that He gives me, I use towards that relationship. That is what true zuhd is. So it might even require me to go out and work so that I can support and provide and fulfill my responsibility. And I work hard. On the surface, it looks like I am a part of this world, I'm not rejecting it, but my intention is that I am fulfilling my responsibility towards Allah. Of course, I have to have different pieces and parts to my life. It should not just be about working, but it should also have moments in my life where I take the time out for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I've taken up too much time. I see the energy levels sort of going down, the eyes starting to close, or less the eyelids starting to close. And inshallah, I will end with this dua and we will do ziyarat afterward. There is a hadith, or rather a dua in Sahifa as-Sajjadiyah, wherein the Imam says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآله واجعل ثنائي عليك ومدحي إياك وحمدي لك في كل حالاتي حتى لا يفرح بما آتيتني من الدنيا. O Allah, make my praise towards you and my sort of all of the things that I look and I see dearly in terms of you, وَحَمْدِ لَكَ فِي كُلِّ حَالَتِي, and my hamd and my thana of you, O Allah, in every single state and moment in my life, so that, again, I'm looking at Allah, حَتَّى لَا يَفْرَحَ بِمَا آتَيْتَنِي مِنَ الدُّنْيَا, so that I do not become overly happy by that which has come to me, that which you have given me from this world. وَلَا أَحْزَنَ عَلَى مَا مَنَعْتَنِي فِيهَا, and O Allah, make me such that I do not become overly saddened by that which you take away from me in this world. وَأَشْعِرْ قَلْبِي تَقْوَاكِ وَاسْتَعْمِلْ بَدَنِي فِي مَا تَقْبَلُهُ مِنِّي, and make my heart filled with your taqwa, and make my body in use of all of that which you are going to accept of me in terms of your ibadah and your obedience. Ya Allah, sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Inshallah, we can stand for ziyarat. And before we do the ziyarat, we can all stand up and do this dua. This is a dua recommended for the last 10 nights of the month of Ramadan. And I will recite it relatively quickly so that we can get to the ziyarat, inshallah. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد اللهم إنك قلت في كتابك المنزل شهر رمضان الذي أنزل فيه القرآن هدى للناس وبينات من الهدى والفرقان فعظمت حرمة شهر رمضان بما أنزلت فيه من القرآن وخصصته بليلة القدر وجعلتها خيرا من 1000 شهر اللهم وهذه أيام شهر رمضان قد انقضت ولياليه قد تصرمت وقد سرت يا إلهي منه إلى ما أنت أعلم به مني وأحصى لعدده من الخلق أجمعين فأسألك بما سألك به ملائكتك المقربون وأنبياؤك المرسلون وعبادك الصالحون أن تصل على محمد وآل محمد وأن تفك رقبتي من النار وتدخلني الجنة برحمتك وأن تتفضل علي بعفوك وكرمك وتتقبل تقربي وتستجيب دعائي
وتمن علي بالأمن يوم الخوف من كل هول أعددته ليوم القيامة. إلهي وأعوذ بوجهك الكريم وبجلالك العظيم أن ينقضي أيام شهر رمضان ولياليه ولك قبلي تبعة أو ذنب تؤاخذني به أو خطيئة تريد أن تقتصها مني لم تغفرها لي. سيدي سيدي سيدي، أسألك يا لا إله إلا أنت، إذ لا إله إلا أنت، إن كنت رضيت عني في هذا الشهر فازدد عني رضا، وإن لم تكن رضيت عني فمن الآن فارض عني يا أرحم الراحمين. يا الله يا أحد يا صمد، يا من لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد، يا ملين الحديد لداود عليه السلام، يا كاشف الضر والكرب العظام عن أيوب عليه السلام، أي مفرج هم يعقوب عليه السلام، أي منفس غم يوسف عليه السلام، صل على محمد وآل محمد كما أنت أهله أن تصلي عليهم أجمعين، وافعل بي ما أنت أهله ولا تفعل بي ما أنا أهله. صلوات صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم أنت السلام ومنك السلام ولك السلام وإليك يعود السلام. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون، وسلام على المرسلين، والحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام على الأئمة الهادين المهديين. السلام على جميع أنبياء الله ورسله وملائكته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام على علي أمير المؤمنين. السلام على فاطمة الزهراء سيدة نساء العالمين. السلام على الحسن والحسين سيدي شباب أهل الجنة أجمعين. السلام على علي بن الحسين زين العابدين. السلام على محمد بن علي باقر علم النبيين. السلام على جعفر بن محمد الصادق. السلام على موسى بن جعفر الكاظم. السلام على علي بن موسى الرضا. السلام على محمد بن علي الجواد. السلام على علي بن محمد الهادي. السلام على الحسن بن علي الزكي العسكري. السلام على الحجة بن الحسن القائم المهدي. عجل الله تعالى فرجك وسهل الله مخرجك، وجعلنا من أعوانك وأنصارك وشيعتك والمستشهدين بين يديك. السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته.